Um, Hi, thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our panel on ethical health journalism. So my name is Jennifer Omani. I'm a freelance journalist based in Senegal, and I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel. Annie Hylton, Puja Changoiwala, and Hannah McNeish. So I will allow them to introduce themselves before we begin, before we go into the main debate. So Hannah, would you like to start?
I'm a freelance journalist who's been based in Africa for 8 years, mostly covering human rights, and in recent years more health projects for print, radio and television.
My name's Annie Hylton. I am an investigative journalist from Canada, but work sort of around the world in different places. I have a background in international human rights law, and I cover mainly gender and human rights issues.
Hi, my name is Puja Changoiwala. I'm based in Mumbai, India. I write about human rights, health, crime, mainly reporting from Mumbai because we have a lot of health issues, in India. So I write for a couple of publications around the world, BBC, The Guardian, Washington Post, etc. Yeah.
So we really came together with the idea of exploring how some of the ethical conundrums we'd come up against as reporters and some of the wider trends we felt weren't really being addressed within the media industry for this panel. So I think I'd like to start with a big one if you report in Africa, as I do, and as Hannah does as well. Annie has also reported from the continent, which is press trips. So very frequently in Western East Africa, you'll be invited by UNICEF or another UN agency to go on an all expenses paid trip to one of their projects so that you can interview a few people and, it's free, but what are you being expected to do there, and what are the sort of ethical implications of that for reporters? So Hannah, could you just give us maybe a couple of examples from your own experience and set up this debate for us?
Okay. So it's particularly in the freelance world, I found quite a lot of my health reporting is motivated by and funded by the NGO sector, who often are setting up trips for you, lining up people for you to speak to, and the big question that I find ethically is trying to balance agendas with, real, true journalism oh, wow. Making sure that your stories are the best that they could be, that they're independent, and that you have all the information before you go. I've been on a few press trips where information has been quite scant before you go, and then you turn up and you realize that you're being lined up with a few people that maybe have been, beneficiaries or been recipients of aid, and the power balance that really throws up in whether the story you're reporting is something that you've got real editorial control over. And I've come up against this in a few situations.
I mean, from my own experience, I remember going on a press trip in Sierra Leone where I was just sort of walked into a hospital. A woman was in the middle of giving birth. She was completely naked. They sort of pushed me into that room, and I was like, I obviously cannot interview this woman right now. She's actually in the process of giving birth. And it was allowed to interview underage rape victims and women who had also tried to abort by themselves, which is illegal in Sierra Leone. So there were several safeguarding issues which were being completely ignored by the agency that I was with. So I wonder, how do we tackle that? How do we establish our own boundaries when we're in these kind of situations? Annie, maybe you'd want to come in on that and grab the mic.
I think for me at least, all of this begins with the idea of informed consent. Regardless of the environment or the circumstance we find ourselves in, if somebody tells us someone is interested in being interviewed and we haven't spoken to those individuals ourselves, we have no idea whether they're consenting to their information being broadcast over different media outlets across the world. So in that instance, I think I personally probably would have stepped away from that situation until the woman would have been in a situation where she could have legitimately consented to my being there. So for me, informed consent is a huge part of journalism in these types of sensitive scenarios.
And I think a lot of that also comes back to the idea of being aware of what you're likely to encounter before you arrive somewhere. I know if you live in the country and you're reporting on that country, that's a little bit easier. Maybe, Pooja, you could give us some insight into that. Like, if you're reporting you're Indian and you live in India, you have a much deeper sense of the cultural context of where you're reporting.
I think as far as consent is concerned, in India, we don't have that concept. I mean, yeah, I mean, I remember there was this, publication which asked me to interview kids who are survivors of incest. And I had to say no, because I did not want to put them through the trauma of, repeating those details. And that story was going to serve no purpose. So I think we, as Indian journalists, we have to draw that line ourselves, because you often have instances where politicians blurt out a rape survivor's name and they go, oops. I mean, that oops is not good enough. You cannot name a survivor, right? So I think in India, we have to draw our own boundaries, draw our own lines. We do not have a manual which tells us, that this is fair and this is not fair. I think consent was taught to me only when I was studying in the UK, where they told us that you have to have these forms and you have to get the kids to fill the forms and you can't show the kids pictures. But in India, we have kids' pictures flashed all over newspapers every time. I mean, there's no question of permission or anything like that. So we have to draw our own boundaries.
And do you see in your work perhaps foreign journalists who don't have much sense of maybe those less obvious boundaries in India when you're reporting? Do you see people who sort of fly in who have a particular idea of what India is about, who maybe overstep the line?
I think foreign journalists have a very touristy perspective, and that is quite legit. I mean, when they come and when they read about and when they learn about virginity tests, they're like, oh, virginity tests. But as Indians, we know that these issues exist, but they still don't have the coverage. But what I like about foreign journalists is that they still go and write about these issues. For example, in Maharashtra, where I stay, I come from Mumbai, they have this place where they have menstrual huts, where women are banished to these huts every month when they're menstruating. And when you take this story, as a freelance journalist, when I take this story to an Indian publication, they'll be like, oh, it's overdone. But how do you judge a problem based on its date? I mean, an old problem is still a problem, right? So what I like about foreign journalists is that they expose these issues, which are still issues, while Indian publications won't give them that footage, because these are done to death. For example, I write a lot about superstition-oriented health issues. For example, women in India, they deliberately undergo, even as the entire world is complaining about how the rate of C-section deliveries is going up. In India, we have 40% deliveries in private hospitals, which are C-section deliveries. Why is that? Because women want to match the birth date of their babies with an auspicious date, say a New Year, say a major Indian festival. So they're deliberately undergoing C-section deliveries. So there are many issues like that, which foreign journalists do tend to take up, but of course they don't have the understanding of local journalists like us, but we don't have the exposure that they do. So I think it's a major conflict there. Yeah.
And I think that idea of access is not only who do you get to speak to, but what do you even know in order to think of getting access to it is really important. Right. I'd really like to hear from the audience later as well on this idea of access, because the more I work with journalists who work for French and Italian media particularly, seem to have a much closer relationship to some of these NGOs. They even will have multiple trips lined up and paid for by an NGO with the agreement of the newsroom. So it's not just a sort of a one-off. It's an agreement that the publication will not cover any of the costs. And I wonder what kind of ethical, dilemmas that throws up, really, because you're sort of being taken where they want you to go. And that's something that I'd love to hear from any French, Italian, Spanish in the audience. So moving on a little bit, we've got expertise here from India, from Africa, but also from Central America. Annie has worked in this region several times, and I wonder, what is the concept there of consent? How does that differ from the other places that we've discussed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in general, I have found that it doesn't really matter where you are. If you're in a remote region where people don't necessarily have access to internet, or they're not regularly checking the media cycle, the idea of explaining what you're doing, what the role of a journalist is, and what your purpose is, why you're there, what the project is that you're working on, the purpose of your project, and the goals of the interview, it sort of spans across the globe for me, I've found. So these concepts of, explaining exactly what you're doing there, explaining to people where their information is going to end up and how that could impact them. Do they know the website or the publication that you're writing for? Do they know that it could get back to their community, perhaps their perpetrator, their family member? Do they understand these concepts? And after you've explained all of these contextualizing factors, does that person then want to participate in your project? And to me, there's really no difference, except if you go to more urban settings where people understand the role of the media, and there's more of an ingrained idea that journalists are there to spread information.
And you were telling me earlier something specific you do to demonstrate to people how, especially their image, will be used. Can you just explain a little bit about that? Because I found that really interesting.
Yeah, this is something that one of my mentors taught me, actually, which is to travel with the publication you're working for, or to have on your mobile phone the website where you're going to be publishing the article, and to physically show people what that looks like if they don't otherwise understand.
Yeah, because I think certainly I work in a lot of rural contexts where people, if they do have access to the internet, it's via a phone, which is just text. So there's no images. They don't, although they may be connected to the internet, it's not an iPhone. It's not the way that we see the internet. So it's really useful, I think, to show them, hey, this is, and by the way, this could be seen by millions of people. Are you aware of that? Yeah. And I wonder also about the role of editors. So we are all freelance journalists. I have been a staff journalist as well in the past. The power balance when you're a freelancer is a bit different. I mean, every article could always be your last for that publication. If you do, you don't get on well with someone, if things don't go smoothly, then it can be very difficult to sort of repair those relationships. And when you're dealing with very vulnerable people, as you are often when we're talking about health journalism, we have to fight for sort of our own ethical boundaries, the ones that we want to set down. But we also have to be aware that the newspaper, website, broadcaster we're working for may have their own views on that. So Hannah, I wondered if you could just give some insight into the various experiences you've had in that way.
Definitely you're up against, well, especially if you're working in some of the developing countries, kind of old tropes of journalism, kind of trying to push back on editors who want to use photos that you don't think are very sensitive, or boil things down to quite a simple issue. the same thing, I think there's been a lot said about how we cover conflict, how we cover sexual violence and sexual health, and there are guidelines that inform that, and there are debates about how that is covered in the Western world versus in Africa, about what photos are shown after, terrorist attacks. But I haven't seen much in terms of health, and I do find myself pushing back quite a lot to try and make these stories more, humanizing, but without really sensationalizing them. And a lot of the time I am filtering already the content that I'm sending in expectation of things being construed in a different way. So when Annie was talking about informed consent, sometimes you can explain everything. You can explain, look, this is a website and it will go here, and then this is a newspaper and it will go all over Europe. And I sometimes have to take the judgment call myself of, I don't know whether this is really understood, especially when people are very vulnerable, especially when it comes to minors, making that decision of what would I think if I Googled myself, 10 years time and found all of this, or whether I, take a photo of somebody and how you take it and how you're trying to encapsulate someone's humanity rather than just showing like some horrible disease they've got or something like that. And so, yeah, I find myself, especially when you're a freelancer and you're dealing with editors who are maybe, a couple of generations older than you and have been around reporting on certain parts of the world in a completely different era, pushing back on how certain topics are covered. And also, yeah, the power balance and the dynamic is different in that situation, but going back to informed consent, when you're also going on a lot of NGO-funded trips, you're already dealing with conundrums of informed consent, interviewing people who are receiving aid in exchange. And so I think there's a real minefield to navigate, and a lot of the time I use my own judgment, and which is quite difficult because you are pushing back against employers and you're pushing back against the people funding your trip. But just to make sure that you're not going to regret what comes out, and that there's some kind of filter, because the guidelines are very
and
fluid.
I think also in this age, journalists are so much more pushed to be personalities, to be brands in their own right. So it's not really, yes, okay, you're publishing with X newspaper or Y website, but the person who's going to get attacked if there's ethical barriers that have been, pushed through, is you, not your editor. And I think that's something so my own personal way of dealing with this sometimes is just to keep details to myself. I don't share a huge amount of my reporting with my editor until I'm really, really sure what I want to say. I don't know whether any of you also use that tactic, but I personally prefer to know exactly what I have before I start launching into telling my editor what exactly I'm going to say. Obviously, I leave with an outline, but I don't know how anyone else approaches that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I faced pushback when I was doing this story about girls with disabilities who are forced into these surgical procedures. They're forced into hysterectomies because of two things. One is their parents want to avoid rape-resultant pregnancies, and the second part of it was menstrual hygiene management was difficult for these kids. So I pitched this story to an editor, and I was in that room, and there's this activist was conducting a session, and he asked, okay, what is menstruation? And these kids, aged 8 to 16, and they're sitting blank. They do not know what menstruation is. Then one of them said periods. So still a numb silence. So the activist asked, okay, do boys get periods too? And still the kids didn't know. And I came back and I was completely taken aback, and the magnitude of the whole thing was like really got to me. And when I pitched that story to the editor, she tells me, okay, but do you have the names of the kids? And I said, you know what, I don't want to do this story for you. I mean, I think you have to take these tough calls, but it's just that it helps you sleep well at night. You cannot name a kid who's 8 who's been forced into a hysterectomy. You cannot name them. Like, it's just basic ethics. So eventually I ended up doing that story for another publication. But yeah, I mean, I think we need to draw our lines ourselves, right? Like,
That's increasingly been my conclusion, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think those of you who work in the UK will be familiar with suicide guidelines. So at the end of almost every story in the UK about suicide, there'll be a short paragraph saying if any of you've been affected by this article, then there's the number for the Samaritans. You can get support if you're triggered by that. There's no such guideline really for a lot of the things that we're dealing with in health journalism, because it's such a complex issue and it spans so many different conditions and experiences. I suppose it would be difficult to narrow it down. But I've certainly never had any training about informed consent or about dealing with vulnerable populations in my own, as a staff journalist for 7 years. No one ever spoke a word to me about that. Same with you.
Yeah.
I don't know about you guys, but...
And I think that comes down to, a lot of the time, making sure that you have all of the local context. I report on the same issues in a lot of different countries, but if you're reporting on, say, HIV in South Africa, and there's a very active civil society and it's very in mainstream conversation, people will disclose a lot of information, they're very open about it, and that's fine. And you go to somewhere else and you just think, oh, right, okay, this is how you do it, and you're jeopardizing people's jobs, their reputations. I just went and did a story about TB, and that is especially difficult to report, and people are very, very sensitive. They don't want their first names used, they don't want everything used, because it has a migration impact. You can't leave to certain countries, you can't work in certain places. But I went in not knowing much of this and not actually being told much of it. And so I just think there's a real onus on journalists to find out exactly what the context is before you go in, because there's some conditions that are a bit of a minefield, and again, you're using your own judgment.
And then, of course, to go a step further, there's sometimes actually legal implications for certain health conditions. So I'm thinking in West Africa specifically, where I work, about abortion, which is illegal in most countries. If you're interviewing someone who's attempted to abort, you're potentially exposing them to criminal charges. And that's something you might want to tell that story, but you're going to have to be exceptionally careful about how you do it, because they've done something that is against the law as well. I don't know if that's ever come up in Central America. I know they also have very restrictive laws there about that. But it's something that you have to be aware of, and if you don't know the law before you leave, before you arrive, then you can really ruin someone's life. So I think also I wanted to talk briefly about working with children and the special measures you have to undertake. I personally try to avoid interviewing children at all. Sometimes you have to for one reason or another, but what does the panel do to make sure that they're protecting children when they are being interviewed, and to make sure that they're not being exploited or exposed to problems? Who'd like to start? No pictures? Okay, Pooja, go ahead.
No pictures, strictly no pictures. I mean, that's what I wasn't taught that while I was a staff reporter. I mean, they still do publish pictures. I was taught that at university, and I stick to that, no pictures, and change names. That's basic, yeah.
I mean, I often, find myself in places where, kids are kind of wheeled out and they're like, look, this child is cute, interview them. And I mean, first of all, you have to make sure that their guardian is present. I've been fobbed off a few times with like, oh, we spoke to their mum on the phone and it's fine, which just, you don't feel comfortable about it. Secondly, they don't, under a certain age, children don't even make the best interviewees, so I often filter them out that way, and their memories can be slightly shady, or I've found a lot of the time they're being prompted by nurses and doctors, and things are being said in the background. And one of the ways that I try and keep my reporting kind of more comfortable and hopefully more ethical is to ask everybody in the room that doesn't strictly need to be there to go or wait until everyone else has finished their reporting and go in, just to try and make interviewees feel more comfortable. And that's especially true of children who, you know, sometimes you can be told they're more than willing to speak, but they look incredibly scared by the fact of it. And those just end up being interviews you kind of don't really want to use, because it feels like they've been a bit press-ganged into it. And yeah, equally, especially in Africa, there are a lot of images historically of children that have been used that are really ethically wrong, and a lot of them have been discussed. You know, the photo in Sudan that with the kid and the vulture that still gets discussed today, and we're still discussing it, and yet you'll still see a photo of a child with, you know, emaciated on the front cover of an American magazine, and you think, would you be selling this story about this condition or disease or disaster in another part of the world? And the question, you know, the answer usually is no. And so, yeah, that geographical, I guess the geographical decisions that are made and how we interview people and who we interview people have to still, you just keep having to question it on every trip you're on, and you keep having to, push back with editors, and they're like, but this, you know, this will sell more papers, and you just think, but when are we going to move on from certain tropes and certain exploitation? And yeah, so
There's been a huge debate in the UK recently about the idea of white saviors with Comic Relief, which is a fundraising program on TV where celebrities every year go to Africa and are pictured with a lot of cute children in doing charity projects. And one black MP pushed back against this and said, I don't understand why we're still perpetuating the same stereotypes of Africa. Why can't they be supporting African businesses or farmers or something that's not vulnerable children, being held by a celebrity? And I think that's something that I'm also really aware of when I'm reporting, that there are a lot of, cute kids running around and they come and say hi, but don't take selfies with them. Don't fall into the trap of seeing them as just part of a backdrop for your Instagram. You're there to do a job and you're there to be a professional. You're not there to perpetuate, a stereotype that I'm sure none of us would want to fall into. I think also we were talking a little bit earlier about NGOs and the power they have over this sector, especially in certain areas of the world. I wonder whether sometimes NGOs also control our language. You see often in people that write about health a lot, they start to employ some of the acronyms used. You'll see NGO is one, I just used it myself, sorry. Charitable organization, or, GBV instead of rape. HRD instead of a human rights defender, capacity building instead of building a school or helping the government to, construct a hospital. How do we fight back against the linguistic, colonization of our language by NGOs? Annie.
That's a good question. I haven't really come across that so much in my own work. What I have come across, though, is even while I'm reporting independently, for instance, I worked on a story about the global gag rule in Ethiopia, and I was being hosted by an NGO for my visa, and also sort of taken around to see different facilities where women were being treated, to sort of understand what the impact there would be on Ethiopian women. And the issue I kind of fell into there was that the NGO was really trying to push for a particular narrative that they really wanted me to sell. And at the same time, not being fully transparent about some of the issues that they were having in terms of funding. And I think relying on NGOs is part of our work, but it also brings up a lot of ethical quandaries, for sure.
I would like someone to answer the language question.
Sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
You don't?
No, but I do want to build on what...
Okay, go ahead, we'll come back.
I think I faced that when I was covering farmer suicides and I was touring villages in India. And I went to an NGO, and so I found some really good stories, again involving children. There was this child who used to follow his father to the field every day because he was worried that, he'll hang himself by a tree. So the kid would follow him every day. But that was a good this thing where I did quote the child. But there were other things which the NGO was trying to push. For example, they made me meet a family, and they said, ask them, they haven't, their father's committed suicide, then they haven't received the compensation. And the kid is busy on a mobile phone, okay, and there's a satellite TV on top of their hut and everything, and I'm like, have you received the compensation? Yeah, we've received it. And then the NGO guy is like nudging him, no, you have to say no. And this guy, then I found out later on that the NGO was run by a political party which was opposed to the incumbent government. So that's what, so you have to.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of agendas that you never really know are happening, and I'm sure I'll never be invited on another NGO press trip. But it is sometimes important to go a bit rogue and to go and find.
Foolish. I was like, wow, these guys are tricking me. I'm here to do a good job. Don't do that.
Just finding a few of your own interviewees and going off piece slightly can sometimes make you feel a lot more confident about certain stories. And I found myself on trips that are supposedly linked to one thing, and there's a news peg, and I've sold it to an editor, and then I've found that actually that news peg doesn't really exist, but they are running out of funding. And you're in a bit of an ethical quandary of just like, okay, I have to file something, but I need to actually find a story, and it's not going to be this one that is being pushed. I wanted to talk about the trend, which I think, I don't know, I'd love to hear from other people, is dying down about a lot of stories that I'm asked to do are app-based. There's so many technology and health stories out there, and to be honest, a lot of them don't really stand up to scrutiny. But they're exciting and they're interesting, and they mean that you can sell health stories to a completely diverse range of people that otherwise wouldn't, magazines, and maybe for a younger generation. But I've been on a few of these trips where it's exciting, and it involves drones, and it involves people from Silicon Valley, and it's great. But they don't work, and you kind of want to join in on the optimism train, but at the same time, you know that as a journalist, you're responsible for highlighting things that do actually work, and that I find the science harder to sell. The science that does look like it really will work in a few years' time is harder to sell than an app or a drone or something that promises to deliver something, and from just looking at the press trip or asking a few questions that it's not quite there. And I'd be interested to know whether other freelancers often get these stories pushed onto them, because I do.
I think sadly most of the time the answer is to actually have an adequate number of doctors, nurses, hospitals, vaccines, very basic infrastructure that's lacking, and blood drones in Rwanda, which is a perennial favorite, is not going to make up for that. I think also there's a slightly odd and actually racist aspect to this, which is like, wow, they're really poor, but they have a mobile phone and they're like making it work. And people like the idea of that juxtaposition of the cutting edge and the backwards village that has nothing, which is inherently a racist assumption of the majority of the time, to me. I'd be interested to hear what the audience thinks about that a bit later. One other thing I wanted to touch on was, what was I going to say? Sorry, I've just forgotten now. Oh, it was related to tech. Yes, so sometimes talking about science is sometimes difficult in these contexts, because if you're a layperson, we're expected as journalists to sort of be experts at everything. We're supposed to be science, health, migration, whatever you like. We're supposed to be able to show that we have a good understanding of what we're writing about. And sometimes if you're talking about very complex science, which an example in my own experience would be gene-edited mosquitoes. So this could one day end malaria through perpetuating a gene that will kill off mosquito populations. Am I the best qualified person in the world to talk about this? No. Am I going to write about it? Yes, I did. But how do we, how do we admit our own limits sometimes, and how do we make sure we're doing the best job we can with some of these topics that are just really genuinely difficult, even for the scientists working on them? Would anyone like to answer that?
It's a tough one.
Wow. You're cornering me. No, I think the basic is to first deeply understand what it is about, and then see if it's really effective. I think you have to have your own objective analysis of what works and what doesn't. It's very exciting when you first come across an invention and you're like, wow, this can revolutionize the world. But you need to really get down instead of with the focus of moving ahead. Instead of moving ahead with the focus of selling the story, I think we need to really objectively sit down, evaluate whether it will be really consequential, understand what it means, and be able to convert it into a language which is understandable to the readers as well. So I think I do that. I break it, I dumb it down for myself and then for everybody else, yes.
I think, after having a few trial and error has made me ask any innovation and health story, proof of concept.
Yeah.
How much are you spending on it? What's the return? What's the cost analysis from sending a drone through the air versus actually killing the local economy of motorbike taxi drivers that transported these things before? Why now is it? And actually, a lot of things don't really pass through that filter. Yeah, because I just think that there seems to be a huge pot of money all of a sudden for innovation and health stories and innovation and health concepts.
India is slow on innovation, so I'm taking it easy right now.
But I think there's a lot of Silicon Valley guilt there. Google or Facebook love to fund things like that tie into their message that tech can save the world. Whereas, yes, if they implemented a road building program in Rwanda, I think that would be useful for a lot more things than just transporting blood or medicine. But that's not very sexy in a tech way, so it doesn't get the attention that it might need.
But I've seen very few stories that have gone back and said, actually, this thing didn't work.
So, absolutely. Well, I'd like to open up the floor for some questions, if possible. So, please, who would like to ask a question? Yes. Sorry, can you just present yourself?
Sure.
First, yeah.
My name is Kara Tabachnik. I'm a freelance journalist from the United States, but I live in Spain, and I cover crime and justice. I was curious, and this does not happen in my beat at all. So how do you present to your editor that you're going on a press trip?
That you're going on a press trip?
A funded press trip, or do you?
A funded press trip. I go on a lot of them, and I think I've been hearing today that it's a lot more common in European journalism than American journalism, apparently. Sorry? Oh, I always disclose it. And actually, I found it's been interesting in recent years because a few publications have started pushing back and saying no to funded trips. And I think that I think it's a really interesting conversation, and there's a panel on it that I really want to go to about, how the NGO narrative is shaping journalism, and especially in places where news is harder to sell. So, based in Africa, trying to sell news to European outlets. And it used to, there was an era when it was just a golden ticket, like, oh, this NGO is going to pay for me to go to this very remote area and cover this story that otherwise wouldn't be covered. Isn't this great? And everybody used to say yes. And then I think that in recent years, there's been a bit of a shift in publications thinking, they're a bit too heavy on content that is either sponsored or funded by charities, especially in the British press, I find. And I've also found that, I've sometimes found myself on trips that are funded by a well-known philanthropist with an NGO that's also funded by a well-known philanthropist, and writing in a section of a newspaper that's funded by and you're just like, this is ethically, these stories wouldn't exist if this funding wasn't there, because I find that the funding for health journalism is shrinking, but at the same time, it really poses problems of, have I just done a perfect circle of this? So I'm always honest about who's paying, and sometimes people, there's different rules of, we won't accept travel, but we'll accept this. I do find that sometimes it will pose problems, and I've caught this during interviews of using a translator that is provided by, a certain organisation that obviously wants a certain part of the story told, and they've lined up the interviewee. But no, I'm always honest about who's paying, yeah, sometimes editors say no, but also sometimes they know that you will go beyond what is on that itinerary and find, do your own reporting and find a story that you think is, most interesting.
Press trips by editors. So they've contacted me and said, we've been given this press trip in your region, would you like to go? Which is obviously much harder to turn down, because again, if you think of the relationship between an editor and a freelance journalist, the more times you say no, the more your chances are increasing of never working with them again. So even if you don't agree 100% with it, it's still, should I just do this and, okay, and try to do, as you say, some other reporting on the side that's potentially more what you wanted to do in the first place, or do I turn it down and then eventually find that they found another person who did want to go on that trip? So it raises a whole other host of problems, basically.
I think it also depends on your rapport with the editor, right? I mean, if the editor trusts you, he would trust you with a paid press trip also, right? I think you have very good relationships with your editors, so I think they will trust you when they say that you're going out on a paid press trip, because they trust your judgment, they trust you'll be objective. So I think a lot depends on your relationship with your editors as well.
Yeah, and I get to pick them, which is good. So you only pitch the ones that you...
I mean, I know I have to do that all the time,
Yeah.
so I wonder how you
we were
navigate
talking about
that.
this before, that in the US it's completely unacceptable, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like we can't accept anything over $25. We can't go out to eat with our sources. They can't pay for anything. I mean, it's, yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Me too. I'm coming with you.
Good morning. I would like to ask something to Pooja.
Hi.
Hi. All we know the situation in India and Pakistan, the fighting for Kashmir. And do you think that a freelancer can try to find some information? Is he or her or she safe in that areas, and how to face this problem?
No, it isn't safe, but it's just that I think freelancers are very, we do not have, first thing, I do not have a press badge. I mean, that's the first, thing, like even if I'm caught up, even if I'm caught, like if a terrorist picks me up, I do not have proof that I'm a journalist. So, I mean, I do not have a press card. That's the basic. So I think it comes with its risks, and you have to decide whether you want to take that risk or no. Personally, I wouldn't go to Kashmir at this point because it is highly conflicted, but I mean, the idea is very romantic to me. I would ideally want to do that, but right now I don't know. I think I would do it with the backing of an organization because it's safer. Because as passionate I am as a journalist, I'm not mindless, and I don't want to be mindless. So I think you should weigh your risks. You should weigh your. There has to be somebody who stands up for you, right? I mean, in Kashmir and all, for example, they pick you up, like they ask for ransom and all, and nobody's going to bail me out. Like who's there to bail me out? My husband. Poor guy, like I don't want to put him through that. So I think you just need to, I'm sorry. I think you just need to weigh your risks, and I wouldn't do it without the backing of an organization, or unless the least I would require is that I have sold the story to a particular publication, and then I'm going to that area with the go-ahead from my editor. So at least I have something to show for it, I mean, for my work, yeah.
And I think that's an important kind of issue around health journalism, especially that we saw during the Ebola crisis, of just kind of freelancers being like dispatched to the front lines with no health insurance, no safeguards, no evacuation plan, and yeah, increasingly as we see kind of deadly diseases. And I know I found myself in places in the middle of DRC and Nigeria, just thinking like, oh wow, everybody in this village has this thing and it's all these flies, and I have actually did not think about this and did not check it out, and I'm not covered for any of this. And and I know that that debate about insurance, I've only ever had since then, I think, since the last few years.
That's why they give so many funds out to freelance journalists. They don't have to protect us, I think. That's why everybody's willing to give freelance journalists awards and funds and everything. Take it and go. But you're responsible.
Lady at the back.
Hello, I'd like to ask you.
Can you introduce yourself? I'd like
Yeah,
to
all right. I come from Finnish Broadcasting Company from Helsinki, and I am also doing health reporting. And I'd like to ask you that when you go to those prepaid trips and they offer your people to be interviewed, so how do you fact check that the stories they tell you are real and not like invented? And how can you be sure that the NGOs, when they offer you someone, they're offering you real stories and not like imagined ones?
Quite a lot of them are just obviously quite staged. You can really tell when it's been staged. You're kind of like, taken into a room and someone just says, oh, my name is something and I got given this and my life is now amazing. And you're like, okay, no one speaks like that. Or, the translator comes back with this like development speak jargon where you're just like, nobody who comes from a rural village in South Sudan would ever utter those words. And sometimes, someone says 2 words and the translator rambles off something about like, this capacity building development something project and la 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 la, and now this NGO has done this, and you're just like, he said 2 words. That's not possible. And sometimes I've actually just said, I found someone else who can speak English, and just said, right, I'll be off for an hour, and you wander around somewhere and you actually just find people that they haven't lined up. And a lot of the time, like on these trips, it's really handy when there are other journalists on there, because you can just grab someone else and go around and check. And you can just tell who's a staged interview. But I mean, there's also the problem sometimes, and that I did come against a couple of weeks ago for a story in TB of people that you've been told who really want to speak to you, and then you find out that they're really desperate and they're in dire straits, and they're giving you a story in front of the people that are going to help them in the hope that they're going to get something in return. Jen was also talking about other areas of the world or certain agencies where interviewees do get paid to speak to journalists, and you really have to be cautious of, ethically, is this story true? Is it the best version of events? Could I factor an extra day or 2 onto this trip, which I usually do, to go and do my own reporting? And then can I interview, are there other NGOs, anything on health, refugee camps? MSF is always a great resource, and they'll often just blow other people's statistics or facts out of the water and say, actually, this is the real situation, and then you get the balance. Making sure that you go slightly off-piste in just interviewing people, everybody who's allied, to the people that set up your trip.
I think also there's, you should treat an NGO interview like any other. It's one person's voice. You need to corroborate what they say. So if you're speaking to somebody, then you find their mother, you find their uncle, you find other people around, and you see if the stories match up. And that's something that's not only true for an NGO, but a government that's organized something for you. I mean, anybody, it doesn't even have to have been organized, but you shouldn't be trusting one source on anything. So the standard practice there would just be to see what matches up, to see if several people are saying the same thing about the same event, and if there are details that seem to massively vary, then ask why and try to fill in those gaps. I think NGOs have a vested interest in their stories being true as well. I would say it's rare for them to say that somebody had a disease that they didn't have, because they wouldn't be able to explain what had happened to them adequately. It's more usually the gravity of what happened to them, or when it happened, or how many times, how many members of the family were affected, things like this. I mean, governments will present complete lies, things that literally never happened and weren't true. I find that less often with NGOs. Not to say it could never happen, but again, it's just following the same procedure that you would follow with any other story, and not relying on the voice of one person when you put it together.
And I would fact check what services they're apparently being given, because that can sometimes be slightly exaggerated, or will have changed by the time you get there.
And I don't think you ever have a story based on a few voices that an NGO has facilitated. You always, I mean, I always back my stories up with figures, with, multiple stakeholders, right? I mean, the victim is just one part of the story. There are so many other, there are government officials, there are record-keeping bureaus, there are many, many other aspects which help you corroborate the facts. I mean, the interviews are is the narrative, but there are facts which have to be incorporated. And once you have the facts corroborating the details, I think you're good, right?
Well, there's a very famous example from last year of a Rohingya woman who was interviewed 4 different times by 4 different media organizations. And to the New York Times, she said that her baby was thrown on the fire by soldiers. She hadn't given that detail to any other media organization. And there was then a big debate about memory and people's memory when they've been traumatized by an event. And this woman may have felt that she was telling the truth each time that she told her story, because she was in such a state of disarray. But what she really didn't need, probably, was to be interviewed 4 or 5 times by 5 different media organizations, facilitated in this case by an NGO. So also having an awareness of, like, has this person been questioned on this several times by several different journalists? Is this the best person to speak to in this moment? Is also something that we should be finding out and asking ourselves, particularly through, victims of trauma. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question about expertise, specifically when you're reporting on health and science. It's kind of a two-parter. One is, do you feel like you have adequate access to experts when you are, reporting on a new scientific finding or a contagion or an epidemic? And I'm also wondering if in those cases when you may not have access to experts when you're looking through the scientific literature, if a lack of access to full article and just having the abstract is a hindrance to your reporting?
So I worked on a series for Huffington Post for a year on neglected tropical diseases, and I was, there were lots of field trips, but I was lacking expert voices, and I found actually Twitter was incredible for finding scientists, and I got loads of interviews over Skype with, London School of Tropical Medicine and people like that who were really helpful, and also very, very helpful in saying, by the way, I wrote this paper, can I send it to you? Unfortunately, they're all about 200 pages long and in deep scientific language. But people were really forthcoming in sending you articles because, otherwise it's very expensive to access some of these things.
I think being a staff reporter also helps. Like, you cultivate your sources, your experts while you're a staff reporter. So I think those sources, those experts are available later also. I mean, and at times when I haven't had the kind of experts I've needed, I've just written emails to relevant people, and they've been gracious enough to respond. I mean, I've never experienced that. Like, I have never been short of experts. I mean, because you just reach out, and they're nice enough to help. So.
Yeah, I've done several pieces for Wired about that intersection between science or health and tech, and I have to say the scientific community have been very open, very helpful, responsive, and open about their work as well. I think at the moment in science there's a big reckoning going on with especially in something like the mosquito thing I was describing. They're being more aware that they have to be more ethical, and they have to think about ethics a lot more because of some of the serious mistakes in the past. So I found people really, really open and helpful, much more than other sectors I could point to that I report on, so yeah.
Hello, I'm Alicia from Taiwan, and I'm also a freelance journalist. And it's really brilliant to hear about like your story and experience. You are like kind of like all very be aware of your positions and how you are involving in the story. But I was wondering that how what was your main or biggest mistake that you have met before, and then how can we learn from that?
Who wants to start? You mean it's related to health journalism, or just in general in life? Biggest ethical mistake. God. Pooja, you can go first.
Wow, no. I'm the punch bag here.
No, we're all gonna answer this.
Yeah,
She
let's
wants
start
an
with
answer
you.
from each person.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
thanks.
I'm thinking of mistakes.
Well, my biggest ethical mistake. I've put my foot in it several times with people, with interviewees, by the scenario that I described of being like shepherded into somebody's house, usually with like a dozen other people, and just being told like, yeah, they said that they're fine to talk to the press, ask away, off you go, and either like asking something that, you know, was not exactly the best question, or you know, kind of launching straight into it without introducing myself, or realizing halfway through the interview that they had actually no idea who I was and were completely bewildered by the dozen or so people in their home, and coming away feeling very uncomfortable, or seeing people, you know, kind of upset, and you've been told a different thing by the NGO of just like, oh, they really want to speak to press, they really want to share their story, and halfway through the interview you realize they really don't, and you take that away with you, and those people stay with you, and or, you know, you interview a child that you're told, yeah, no, this is fine, and they become visibly upset. And so, you know, that's what I was talking about earlier, of just like really relying on yourself, really doing what Annie suggested of like, again, it doesn't matter whether you've been, you know, they've been told, oh, these people are coming. A lot of the time it's like, these people are coming, and by the way, we're giving you stuff, so you'll talk to them. So really making sure you explain who you are, really kind of not rushing interviews, asking those background questions, and reporting sensitively on some of, you know, these issues that are really, really delicate, and you have no idea before, you know, whether other people in the family have, you know, whether they've just lost somebody, how vulnerable they are. And I've got around that by just asking more questions now, just asking whoever has lined up the interview, you know, what exactly is going on, or making sure that I can have an interview just with me and one person, and go slowly and at the pace that I want to, so that you, yeah, avoid things like that, and yeah, choosing the photos and the quotes that I send to editors, so that I'm in control of what comes out, and I don't feel, oh wow, I don't want my name associated to that. I have to say I still have a problem with headlines coming out where you're like, oh my God, my name is attached to that. And as I said, you know, having to send it to scientists that you've interviewed, being like, here's the article, I didn't pick the headline, thank you very much. Yeah, I guess that would be it.
I think I'll speak more generally about situations I can envision in the past where I didn't necessarily have the knowledge that I do now about how my presence and my reporting can impact people, and what it actually means to get someone's consent, and what it means to talk to traumatized people, and how to go about that kind of interview as opposed to interviewing a regular civilian or an official. And I think there are times that I look back and I think, wow, I wonder if I actually explained what I was doing properly and how that impacted somebody. And I think the other thing is that I constantly have to remind myself not to fall into this sort of, I don't want to say advocacy, but as someone who comes from a human rights background, it's easy for me to kind of want to, you know, put my feelings forward, and that's something I constantly have to battle with, just being factual and objective, and there have been times definitely where I think I went too far. So I think about that a lot. And the other, I think, is in telling stories about vulnerable issues and sensitive populations, it's really easy to fall into sort of painting people in broad strokes as victims, and I've certainly done that myself. And something I've learned is really to show people in their full humanity, in acts of creativity and love and decision making, and how are these full people outside of the crime or the vulnerability, or so yeah, I think those are sort of the main things I've learned from people who know a lot more than I do. So yeah.
So I'm told that we have to stop now. So I'm afraid that our worst mistakes will have to go to our graves.
I'll email you my answer.
Pooja can follow this up.
Yes.
But thank you so much for coming and for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.